Sixth grade is a weird time. On one hand, you're being told that you're the big kid on the block, and that's it. It's time to grow up. But on the other hand, some of your classmates still believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. When Payton Leutner's best friends started talking about the spooky internet character, Slender Man, she thought it was just a new game that they were playing. She could have never imagined the hold that the fictional character would have on the girls and just how far they would go to prove his existence. In May of 2014, a cyclist was going for a ride in the beautiful sunny weather of Waukesha, Wisconsin. As he was biking, he reached the end of a road where he found 12-year-old Payton Leutner laying in the grass covered in wounds. She was barely clinging on to life, so the cyclist immediately called 911 for help. When the officers got there, they could tell that Payton was in an immense amount of pain, but even though she could barely move, she was still able to tell the officers who attacked her in the woods her 12-year-old best friend, Morgan. I don't know if that's something best friends do to one another, but Payton's injuries were so bad the police didn't even know if she was going to make it. So they were trying to pull as much information out of her as quickly as possible. They found out that Morgan didn't act alone. According to Payton, there was another girl that helped hold her down while Morgan slashed her. The police then showed up at Morgan's house and talked to her mom, Angie. Angie told officers that Payton, Morgan, and their friend Anissa all had a sleepover at their home the night before, but none of them were currently there. The three girls initially got together for Morgan's 12th birthday. They spent the whole day doing 12-year-old girl things like roller skating, eating ice cream, and watching movies. This detail is so disturbing to me. Like, you spend the whole day doing all your favorite tween girl activities, and to end your big B-Day bash, you decide that it's time to become a criminal? Like, clearly there's a lot more to the story than just meets the eye. Morgan's mom said the three girls went to the park that morning, but she hadn't heard from them since. I also find it a bit weird that the mom let these 12-year-old girls just walk to the park by themselves, but apparently that wasn't a normal thing. Angie said as a treat for her birthday, she thought she'd give her daughter a little independence by letting her and her friends go to the park alone. She thought it was safe enough since the three girls would have each other. But she would have never suspected that the only real danger at the park would be her own daughter. Authorities then set out to search for the two missing 12-year-olds, afraid that they too could be in some sort of grave danger. Shortly after their search began, officials found Morgan and Anissa sitting on the side of a freeway after having walked for around 5 hours straight. The girls were dirty and covered in stains, but were otherwise calm and spoke meekly with the officers. At this point, Payton was still in surgery and doctors weren't sure if she was going to make it. She had a bunch of deep cuts in multiple organs and things just weren't looking good. So now the cops were just really freaking confused about what actually went down. They thought something was missing, so they took Morgan and Anissa down to the station and threw them in separate rooms where they were questioned for hours. The one thing that investigators were super shook about was about how calm Morgan remained throughout her whole questioning. They said she was sitting there in the police precinct, covered in red stains, just acting like it was just another normal day. The investigators' best guess was that the girls fought over a boy because they couldn't imagine what else tween girls would actually fight about that would lead to such a brutally violent ending. But if the detectives were confused on a motive then, they would have never guessed what these girls were about to tell them. So Morgan told officials that she had every intention of finishing Payton off. She asked them if they found Payton and wondered if she was alive or not. Morgan claimed the two girls attempted to snuff Payton in order to appease whoever it was Anissa was talking about. And then she said, "This is going to get me arrested, isn't it?" Okay, so we have a girl who is clearly aware that she's done something wrong because she knows she's going to be arrested. But at the same time, she's just totally calm and acting like it's another day in the life of a sixth grader. Hey, could you pass me those crackers and juice box? I would get it, but these cuffs are a little tight. Morgan went on to explain that Anissa said that they had to take out Payton in order to appease the man, because if they didn't, the man would execute their families. Morgan claimed she didn't personally know this man, but Anissa did. In the room next door, Anissa was telling the police about Slender Man, a frightening character who she read about on a horror website. Now, I'm sure most of you who are children of the internet have heard of the Slender Man, but at the time, the police had no idea who this mysterious man was. So now it was time for the investigators to take a deep dive down into the Slender rabbit hole. So Slender Man was actually this creepy humanoid creature that started popping up in the stories around the internet circa 2009. He is often depicted as a lanky, thin man in a black suit who could be anywhere from 6 to 14 feet tall, with stretchy limbs and a smooth and faceless pale head. Basically, there are a bunch of legends and stories about Slender Man that live on the internet, as well as some movies and video games that feature him. Anissa told the police that Slender Man had these long, dark tendrils protruding from his back that he would use to choke the life out of his victims, which were usually children. The girl said she knew Slender Man was real because one day on the bus to school, she saw him standing in the forest before he disappeared into the trees. Anissa claims she was really scared because Slender Man could easily take out a family in 3 seconds, so she explained that they had to show him that they were worthy. Can I just say, I'm so glad that I only played with like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Because my biggest worry when I was growing up was just trying to catch all the Pokemon and try to find the Blue Eyes White Dragon. But Anissa told the detectives it was Morgan's idea to choose Payton as their victim. She also said that Morgan was the one who found out that the Slender Man lived in a big mansion in the middle of Nicollet National Park, which is where they were planning to walk to after they take out Payton. The girls both believed that if they successfully executed Payton, they would become Slender Man's loyal servants and live with him in his mansion forever. So in one room, you've got Anissa saying Morgan was the one who orchestrated the whole thing and knew all the deets about Slender Man. And in the other room, you've got Morgan saying that it was Anissa who was the mastermind behind the slaying. Morgan claimed that she didn't know who the man was, but didn't want to make Anissa mad, so she just went along with it. So who was telling the truth? Because both girls were trying to put the blame on the other, while also fully admitting to the fact that they'd been planning on harming their best friend for 6 months. At this point, the police could barely comprehend that they were dealing with two 12-year-old girls who would do something so vile. But they continued the interview and eventually asked the girls how they planned to attack Payton. Morgan and Anissa said they would talk in code about their plans, often calling the weapon a cracker, and the slang an itch. First, the girls planned the itch for the night of the sleepover, saying that they would duct tape her mouth and slice her neck with the cracker. But the girls said that they were too tired from their long day of roller skating and ended up going to bed. So now they had to think of a new way to scratch that itch. All 3 girls woke up the next morning and started playing dress up. As Payton was putting on a pink princess dress, Morgan and Anissa were talking about taking her to the bathroom stall at the park to itch her because it had a drain in the floor, which would make it for an easy cleanup. The devious duo decided to go with that plan, so they asked Morgan's mom if they could all go to the park. She said yes, and off they went. So Anissa said it was Morgan who grabbed the cracker, but Morgan claimed it was Anissa. At this point, the detectives were starting to get a feel for who was the leader and who was the follower. They believed that Anissa was telling the truth and thought that there was a lot of intentional deception in Morgan's story. The interviewers mentioned Anissa would say this is what happened, and Morgan would be like, I think Anissa did this, or I think this happened, continuously pushing the blame off of herself. Anissa said she read on the internet that it was easier to take someone out if they were asleep or unconscious. So she told officials that she and Morgan tried to knock Payton out by banging her head on the concrete, but ending up losing their nerve and leaving the bathroom. Which, I guess they didn't hit her head that hard. I don't know if my friends tried to crack my noggin on the wall, I wouldn't exactly keep hanging out around them. And I'm not blaming Payton, I just find that detail so strange. Did they hurt Payton often? I just feel so bad for her. So after Morgan and Anissa realized it was way harder to knock someone out than it appeared on TV, Morgan suggested that they all go bird watching in the woods. When the 3 girls got there, they decided to play a round of hide and go seek. Morgan counted while Payton and Anissa hid. The plan was for Anissa to tackle Payton to the ground while Morgan scratched that itch with the cracker hidden in her sweatshirt. This was a part of the plan from the beginning that both girls told the investigators. They said Morgan would just do the slicing because Anissa just couldn't do it. So Morgan pretended to count and Anissa told Payton to get on the ground so she could cover her up with leaves and twigs. And finally, after plans A and B failed, plan hide and see was a success. Except of course for the fact that Payton survived. That's right, Payton against all odds survived her attackers. In an interview at the hospital, Payton said she remembered lying there, going in and out of consciousness as her 2 friends were on top of her, jabbing as fast as they could. After a while, Payton said Morgan and Anissa stopped attacking her and just kind of stared at her with blank faces, which is when Anissa lied, saying she and Morgan would go get help. At this point, Payton knew that the 2 girls were definitely not going for help, so she willed herself to stand up and blindly stumbled out of the forest. She was barely conscious and had a puncture in her diaphragm, so it was really hard for her to breathe. Payton tried leaning her weight on trees to hold herself up and just kept telling herself to get out of the woods and make it to the road where she would hopefully be saved. And by the grace of Gouda, she made it out and saw this patch of green grass where she collapsed. And a few minutes later, the cyclist found her. You know those stories about moms that are able to save their children from under the car because they suddenly get superhuman strength? Well, I feel like Payton just had that moment and she's not even a teenager yet. In this kitchen, we stand Payton Leutner. So let's get back to the 2 slashers. So Morgan told the detectives how weird it was that she feels no remorse at all while jabbing at her best friend. She said she thought she'd feel excitement or remorse or something, but instead she felt nothing at all. I'm not an expert, so I'm not gonna harp on this too much, but clearly Morgan is dealing with some sort of mental issues. To say you just feel nothing at all really suggests some deeper things going on here. And it's just sad that she didn't get any help sooner. The two 12-year-old girls were charged as adults and taken to a juvenile facility, which sounds like an oxymoron, but that's actually what happened. As Payton put it, if you commit a juvenile crime, like stealing a candy bar, you get a juvenile punishment. But if you commit an adult crime, you get an adult punishment. Spoken like a true genius. During the investigation, officials found notebooks in Morgan's school locker with drawings and notes all about Slender Man. In her bedroom, they found dolls that had their heads, arms, and legs chopped off. They also found more violent notes and drawings. On Morgan's computer, investigators discovered an email sent to Anissa going over how to clear the browsing history. Are we sure this girl is 12? You're telling me Casey Anthony couldn't remember to clear her incriminating searches, but this 12-year-old girl knows how? It was very clear to investigators that Morgan was the ringleader of the operation, and they knew that they were about to experience a trial unlike any that they'd seen in their entire careers. Both girls plead guilty, but ended up entering a not guilty plea by some reason of mental disease. In 2017, Anissa was sentenced to 25 years in a state institution, and Morgan was sentenced to 40. Today, Payton is still coping with her trauma, but celebrates her incredible will to survive. When her story first hit the news, she was still recovering from the ordeal and asked for privacy. Yeah, I don't blame her at all for taking a few years to process and heal. But 5 years later, when Payton was 17, she finally decided to share her story with the world in an hour-long televised interview. In the interview, Payton said she had come to accept her 19 scars because they've made her who she is today. A lot of people asked Payton how her and Morgan became friends in the first place. Payton was a happy, positive, and bubbly girl, where Morgan was much more intense with a serious dark side. Payton explained that in 4th grade, she noticed that Morgan always sat by herself and struggled to make friends, so she decided to befriend her. Payton told interviewers her mom taught her that no one should ever have to sit alone, and that everyone deserves at least one friend in their life. Payton said she considered Morgan her best friend. They would hang out all the time, have sleepovers together, and do all the normal things little girls would do. She even said Morgan wasn't always dark and sinister. Payton said her friend was funny, artistic, and imaginative. Then in 6th grade, Morgan and Anissa became friends and started talking about Slender Man. And that's when Payton said everything went downhill. Payton wanted nothing to do with Slender Man and found the whole thing quite terrifying. But she tried to play along and be a supportive friend because she knew that's what Morgan liked. I'd just like to point out that Payton is a literal angel and did nothing to deserve a single thing that happened to her. May we all have a friend like Payton. Payton eventually told Morgan that the whole Slender Man thing was starting to freak her out and she wanted nothing to do with him. But at this point, it was way too late. Morgan was convinced that Slender Man was real. Payton even considered ending her friendship with Morgan, but she said that if she did, she would be afraid Morgan wouldn't have any friends. And as Morgan's obsession with Slender Man grew, so did Anissa and Morgan's friendship. Payton was not a fan of Anissa, but still hung out with her because she knew it was important to Morgan. Unlike Payton, Anissa made no attempts at trying to be nice to her, and was very jealous of the fact that Payton and Morgan were such good friends. Anissa was the one who really convinced Morgan that Slender Man was real. Payton just couldn't hang with the fact and tried to distance herself from the two girls. Payton said she could never have imagined what the two were planning that fateful day in the woods, but when she found out what the motive was, she believed it. She said Morgan was so obsessed with wanting to prove that Slender Man was real that she would do just about anything. It also came out during the trial that Morgan had early onset schizophrenia and that her dad had been diagnosed with the same condition when he was a child. Because of this, Payton said she was angry that Morgan's parents ignored the signs and symptoms. When asked what she would like Morgan to know, Payton's own answer surprised herself. She said that she would like to thank Morgan because the incident made her the person she is today, and that she really, really likes her life now. But Payton is still traumatized by the event, and it took her years to rebuild her life back to some sort of normalcy. To this day, she still sleeps with a pair of broken scissors underneath the pillow next to her, just in case. And she says that she never plans on being in the same room as Morgan and Anissa ever again. I don't blame her. Payton hopes to attend college and work in the medical field, which was most definitely inspired by her incident. She wants people to know that she is definitely doing well now, and she would like to put the past behind her and live a normal life. And that, my friends, is the treacherous tale of how two 12-year-old tweens became convicted criminals over a character on the internet. I'm super stoked to dig in the charcuterie board, and I gotta tell you, I've been itching to try some of these crackers. So I'm gonna do that. I'll catch you guys next time.
Hiking trails are fun and all, but they're also super creepy. Like, you never know who could be lurking in the woods ready to pounce. One time, a couple in the 90s set out to hike the entire Appalachian Trail, but they never finished, and it wasn't because they were tired. So the Appalachian Trail is the longest hiking-only footpath in the world. It's over 2,000 miles long and crosses through 14 states from Maine to Georgia. That's pretty long, which means there are plenty of opportunities for some creepy mountain man to attack. 26-year-old Jeff Hood and 25-year-old Molly LaRue met in Salina, Kansas. They were both social workers for a church-sponsored program where they took at-risk youth on nature trips to help expose them to the great outdoors. But when the two found out they were about to be laid off, they started to brainstorm their next move. Jeff and Molly were both unsure about what they wanted to pursue next, but they knew they loved each other and the outdoors. And that's when it came to them. They were going to hike the Appalachian Trail. It would be the perfect way for them to get to know each other and decide what they wanted to do next in life. Before their trip, Molly called her dad and told him she was going on a 6-month cross-country hike with her new boyfriend. Whew, I bet that was a tough phone call. That's a lot of news to drop at once. One time I called my dad and I had to tell him that I'm going to Thailand with the boy I'd only known for 2 weeks. I feel you, Molly girl. So the trail takes 6 months to complete. You can either start in Georgia and hike to Maine or go the other way around. 9 in 10 people start in Georgia, so naturally Molly and Jeff decide to take the path less traveled and start in Maine. So Molly and Jeff began planning their trip for the summer. Molly wiped out her savings and stocked up on everything she needed for her and Jeff's journey. On June 4th, the couple began their hike. They started at Mount Katahdin in Maine and began making their way south. They took a bunch of pictures and signed in on trail logbooks along the way. They were thriving. So a lot of hikers who signed these logbooks would write about their experiences, leave words of advice, or express gratitude for people who kept the trails up. But they all signed off with their trail name instead of their real name. It's like the old-timey version of an Instagram handle. So Molly went by the name Nalgene, and Jeff went by the name Clevis. You could tell the duo was having a blast on the trail because they left behind upbeat messages. One time, Molly wrote this super quirky poem in one of the logbooks. It said, "Last evening I whispered, I think there are less bugs. This morning, bring on the slugs. Through the roof of our tent, I see their familiar sludge. The stuff that resembles butterscotch fudge. Squished between my toes and my sandal. Yuck. This is something I just can't handle." Okay, Dr. Seuss. One of the hikers who was behind them on the trail named Earl mentioned reading this poem when he was tired, in pain, and covered in blisters and mosquito bites. He thought to himself, how can this Nalgene person be so obnoxiously happy? Well, I'm glad he said it because I was thinking the same thing. Like, they had to be so exhausted and smelly at that point, but Molly somehow still had the energy and enthusiasm to write a poem about slugs. Couldn't be me. When I'm hiking, I'm like so in the zone. Sunscreen's on, backpack is full of snacks, water is full. Couldn't bother me. So Molly and Jeff continued to hike all throughout the summer. Earl said the couple continued to write upbeat notes in the logbooks, and he actually ran into them along the trail that July. Earl described Molly as blonde and dimpled, quick to smile, spirited, and funny. He described Jeff as bearded and beetle-browed with a smoky, high-pitched Tennessee drawl. Okay, based on those descriptions, I feel like Earl had a crush on Molly or something, because he was so nice in describing her but then said her boyfriend was beetle-browed. Seems like someone might be a bit jealous. When Earl met the couple, he was with another hiker named Greg. They had all stopped to stay at a shelter along the trail in New Hampshire. All 4 of them were getting to know each other and talking about their experiences when some creepy dude named Reuben came up to them. Reuben was super rude and demanded the space along the shelter's east wall where Greg had already set up camp. Has this dude ever heard of the term first come, first serve? You can't really make reservations in the mountains. Greg stood his ground and told the dude he'd have to settle for a spot in the middle, but Reuben continued to cause issues. The next morning, Reuben woke up super early and started chanting and dancing around in the middle of the shelter for like 2 hours. Yo, this dude has got to go. These people are probably so sleep deprived, like they don't need to deal with some weirdo performing seances. Earl, Greg, Molly, and Jeff continued on their journey and actually met up again at a bunkhouse in New Hampshire. They had a few drinks and stayed up super late talking that night about the trail, Molly and Jeff's plans to attend grad school, and they roasted Reuben a bit. After their gossip session, the group split back up and got back on the trail. Earl ended up straying from Greg. Molly and Jeff had a bunch of late starts and lunch breaks, so Earl then passed them up. But they stayed in touch through the logbooks. On September 11th, Molly and Jeff stopped in Duncannon, Pennsylvania. At this point, they were just a few days from reaching the halfway mark. That night, they decided to treat themselves to a hotel stay. Oof, I bet that shower felt so good. I hope they had enough shampoo though, because like, the hotel shampoos are always so small and these people were probably stanky. They got a room at the Doyle Hotel, which was right along the trail. It wasn't a super nice hotel, but Molly and Jeff didn't care. Honestly, they were just happy to have a mattress to sleep on. That night, they ordered pizza, called their parents, and opened some mail that was sent to them by friends. The following morning, Molly and Jeff packed up their things and continued to head south. They made it to the Thelma Mark shelter on the top of Cove Mountain in Pennsylvania, which is where they spent their last moments alive. So the shelter was a 3-sided lean-to nestled in between some trees about 30 feet off the trail. By the time Molly and Jeff had gotten there, they had already hiked through 8 states and covered about 1,000 miles. So they were super beat. They got all cozy in their sleeping bags and fell fast asleep. That next afternoon, a couple who called themselves the Lone Moccasins was trekking along the path where they planned to take a break at the Thelma Mark shelter. What was going to be a relaxing pit stop turned into a tragic discovery because this couple stumbled across the corpses of Molly and Jeff. The Lone Moccasins freaked out and rushed to the closest town to report the bodies. Yeah, I bet that couple was trying to get out of there super quick so they didn't become the attackers' next victims or the detectives' top suspects. Later that evening, the police arrived at the shelter to investigate, but they were struggling hardcore. Like, it took them 3 hours to get there because it was dark and they said they were in dress shoes. Someone gonna tell them they could have changed their shoes? Once they finally got there, officials determined that Molly and Jeff had been lifeless for about 12 to 16 hours. Officials noted that both victims didn't pass away immediately. They laid there and lost fluid for several minutes until breathing their last. After talking to some locals and a few other hikers who were on the trail, detectives were able to gather a description of the perp. They were looking for an unkempt white male wearing a flannel, jeans, and work boots. He was seen carrying a small rucksack and 2 bright red gym bags. The people who described the man said he looked like a hitchhiker who didn't belong on the trail. I can't tell if they're hike-shaming this guy for not having the right gear or if they're just trying to say he looks suspicious. Either way, detectives searched for the man around the area but had no luck. 8 days later, 2 hikers spotted a guy that fit the description. But instead of wearing work boots, he was wearing Jeff's hiking shoes. He was also repping his backpack and watch. Yo, did this dude seriously just take out Jeff for his kicks? That's pretty extra. So the hikers who saw this man reported him to the National Park Service. Later that night, he was trying to cross the Harper's Ferry when officials stopped him and brought him in for questioning. The mountain man said his name was David Casey Horn from South Carolina. But detectives saw through his BS and found out he was actually a man named Paul David Cruz, who was on Florida's most wanted list. So Paul was the leading suspect in a major crime that took place in Florida 4 years earlier. What's the crime, you ask? Slaying a young woman. Well, we know he's capable of doing that to Jeff and Molly then. In July of 1986, a woman offered Paul a ride home from a Florida bar. And something terrible must have happened on the drive because she was later found lifeless on an abandoned railroad bed with her head almost completely severed from her body and her clothes off. Paul drove her liquid-stained car to his brother's place in North Carolina. He knew the police were after him, so he got his brother to drive him out of town and give him a stack of cash. The police eventually recovered the woman's car and clothing, as well as Paul's blade, but they couldn't find Paul. From then until this moment, Paul spent his time hitchhiking around, until he landed himself in the interrogation room for Molly and Jeff slayings. Unlike most crimes we cover on this show, this one was pretty easy to solve. Not only was Paul wearing Jeff's backpack, shoes, and watch, but he was also still carrying the weapons he pulled on the couple. It was a blade that was used on Molly and a .22 caliber pistol that was used on Jeff. Paul's DNA was tested against the sample found on Molly, and it was a match. And as if it wasn't already clear as day that Paul was the guy the cops were looking for, he left some of his belongings at the shelter and dropped his red gym bags along the route. Okay, Captain Obvious. And with that, Paul went to trial. Over 150 pieces of evidence were presented and around 60 witnesses took the stand to testify against Paul. The jury took 49 minutes to deliberate and came back with a verdict: guilty. Paul was first given 2 terminal sentences, but that was later reduced to life in prison. He is now serving his time at a jail in Pennsylvania. But even though Paul was caught, detectives still couldn't figure out why he attacked Molly and Jeff. They weren't sure if the couple was in some kind of trouble, but based on their good reputation with the other hikers, that was highly unlikely. They also didn't know if they were approached by Paul in their sleep or if they had a conversation that escalated to their attack. Before their brutal demise, Molly and Jeff actually made plans to meet up with their family at the halfway mark, which was in Harper's Ferry. A few days before their scheduled meetup, Jeff called his mom and asked her to bring soap and brushes so him and Molly could clean up. Jeff's mom agreed and even told her son she'd bring him 2 pumpkin pies. You know, the most essential thing for a hiking trip. Before hanging up, Jeff told his mom that he and Molly had something special to share with the family once they were all together. Jeff's family speculated it was an engagement announcement, but they never found out what it was. Wait, that is so tragic and such a cliffhanger. I hope that was the news because that would mean they were at least happy and in love in their final moments together. Oh my gosh, this is like the hiking version of the Titanic. In Jeff and Molly's last logbook entry, they responded to a previous hiker who claimed he was the last of the 90s southbounders. They wrote, "You most certainly are not the last entry of the season. As you can't read this, we'll tell you when we catch you. As we hear it, we're about mid-slip of the southbounders moving down. Oops, getting food on the book. Good food too. Time to go. Clevis and Nalgene." And that's all they wrote. The story of Jeff and Molly sadly isn't the only horrific slayings that's happened on the Appalachian Trail. I mean, it's a pretty long trek, so there are bound to be more crimes that have happened over the years. There are 13 reported slayings that have happened along the path. The oldest known incident took place back in 1974, and the most recent incident happened in 2019. About half of the cases remain unsolved to this day, which means the villains are still out there on the loose. And it also probably means there are a lot of vengeful ghosts along the trail too. Okay, so after hearing this story, I don't think I'm going hiking anytime soon. Or at least not on the Appalachian Trail. Maybe I'll just put a tent in my backyard instead. That way, I can steer clear of creepy mountain men that want to steal my shoes and annoying guys named Ruben who perform noisy early morning rituals. But I'll definitely still roast some marshmallows for s'mores. That's a must. Stay safe out there. I'll see you next time, hopefully.
In 2015, Washington, D.C. firefighters responded to a seemingly average call about a house fire. But once they arrived at the house, which was actually a multi-million-dollar mansion, they discovered much more than they bargained for. 4 bodies more than they bargained for. The corpses found that day were identified as a 46-year-old businessman named Savvis Savopoulos, his wife, their 10-year-old son, and their housekeeper. Before I continue, let's just address this dude's name. Savvis Savopoulos. What a freaking epic name. All 4 individuals were all covered in puncture wounds, doused in gasoline, and appeared to have been beaten with a baseball bat as well. That's horrible. Clearly, this was out of the firefighters' wheelhouse, so they called their police friends to come check out the scene while they put out the fire. When the police arrived, they immediately declared everyone is deceased, except for the housekeeper. The housekeeper was given CPR and rushed to the hospital where she passed away moments later. In their search, investigators found a baseball bat covered in vital fluid, a sword from Savvis's samurai collection, a box of half-eaten pizza from Domino's, and a hair. Like, how did we go from a samurai sword to leftover pizza to a single strand of hair? I'm interested to see how all of this connects. Based on the look of things and the evidence uncovered, officials determined that all 4 individuals had been held hostage in their own home for over 18 hours before being terminated and set on fire. So whoever did this to them must have known them, right? And I wonder what they had against all 4 of them, especially a 10-year-old little boy. Well, if you can't already tell by his name, Savvis Savopoulos was a baller. He was the CEO of a popular construction firm and had a lot of money. In fact, the house they lived in and were executed in was a $4.5 million mansion in a super wealthy neighborhood, like right down the street from the vice president's house. Aside from his booming business, Savvis was big into martial arts and made plans to open his own studio. He was also known for being a big supporter of the local Greek Orthodox church and even coached his kids' soccer games. Oh, and Savvis actually had 3 kids, but his 2 daughters were away at boarding school when all of this happened. Alright, so if Savvis was rolling in the dough and running a huge company, he definitely had a target on his back. But who would want to take out a super charitable, family-oriented man with a big heart? Apparently someone did. Let's find out who. So the house had security cameras, but all of them had been taken, along with their SIM cards. But those weren't the only cameras in the area. Officials were able to pull footage from a traffic camera in the area where they saw a man wearing all black run away from the house and drive off in Amy's Porsche. Later that afternoon, the car was located at a church parking lot about 10 miles away from the family's house, but it was completely torched. The next step in the investigation was to interview friends, family members, and co-workers of the Savopoulos family for more information. Here's what officials found out from Savas' other housekeeper, Nellie. Oh yeah, Savas had 2 housekeepers, so you know he made it big. Everyone should have a maid. Even the maid. So Nellie said she was with Savas hours before the incident. They were about 25 miles away from Savas' home at a martial arts studio he was about to open. While they were there, Savas got a call from his wife, Amy. She asked him to come home because she wasn't feeling well and needed help with their son. Being a good husband and dad, Savas immediately left to go help his family. But the housekeeper mentioned this was a bit odd of Amy to ask, because they typically had babysitters there to help with the kids when needed. Huh, that's interesting. I wonder if Savas speculated anything when he got the call. Either way, something fishy is going on. When Savas pulled up to his house, he probably didn't know it yet, but shit was about to go down. Cue the chaos. The night before the savage slayings, Savas called Nellie and left her a voicemail. In the voicemail, Savas told Nellie that Amy was sick and the other maid, Vera, was going to stay the night to help the family out. He said Vera's phone had died and she didn't have a charger. He asked Nellie to tell anybody that might be worried about Vera that she would be staying the night with them. After that, he told her not to come to work the next day and asked for her to send him a text once she heard the voicemail. All of this is so weird. First of all, why would the maid stay over and help the family instead of a babysitter? And why would Vera not be able to use Savas' phone to call her family if she really needed to? So Nellie didn't listen to the voicemail until the next day. But when she did, she thought it was super strange. She also got a text from Amy telling her not to come into work that day. Ugh. This is so sad because Amy and Savas are clearly looking out for Nellie, but at the same time, I wonder if they were sending her these messages also as a cry for help. But if that were the case, they should have been a bit more obvious. Like maybe toss in a subtle, "Help! I'm being held hostage in my own home." Is that too obvious? Maybe people should start creating code words with their maids for if they're ever being held against their will. Something like, "I need help cleaning the baseboards," because that would be so apparent something is up. Like, who cleans their baseboards? If I need a friend to help me get out of a bad date, my code word is, "Hey, help me get out of this bad date." It's very effective. All right, let's get back on track. So Nellie got all these weird messages from Savas and his wife not to come in, so she didn't. But the other housekeeper, Vera, wasn't blessed with that same fate because she was at the house and was apparently being held against her will. And I guess Nellie didn't reach out to Vera's family to let them know where she was because after Vera didn't come home that night, her husband got worried and stopped by Savas' house to look for her. Vera's husband told officials that when he got to the house, he saw the Porsche parked outside and assumed the family was home. But no one answered the door when he knocked. Then Savas called Vera's husband and told him Amy was at the hospital and Vera went with her. Also, why would the housekeeper randomly be doing so much stuff outside of her job requirements? Like, why didn't anyone else raise an eyebrow when the family said this woman was going to spend the night and then accompany Amy at the hospital? If that's the case, homegirl needs a promotion. Vera's husband later told investigators that he had a feeling somebody was inside, but he left. He was so close to possibly saving 4 lives. So another person who officials talked to was Savas' assistant. He had some super steamy tea that turned into a solid lead for the case. The night before the big event, Savas called and left his assistant a voicemail asking him to go to his office the next morning for a package. The assistant was then directed to meet with the chief financial officer of the construction company, who gave him $40,000. Yeah, that's not sketchy at all. After that, Savas texted his assistant and told him to drive to his house and leave the cash in the seat of Amy's Porsche. In what world is this a normal task for the assistant? Like, how was he not more suspicious about taking 40 G's out of his boss's bank account and dropping it in an empty car with no one around? And does that mean he was at their house when the family was inside being held against their will? This is wild. Later, investigators made the connection that where the charred Porsche was found was also right by the apartment complex Savas' assistant grew up in. Ooh, so maybe it was the assistant, and he's trying to make it look like someone else did it? But the assistant said he never saw anyone during his money drop exchange and ended up having an alibi. Okay, so it's back to the drawing board for investigators. They turned back to the evidence they had: a baseball bat, a samurai sword, half-eaten pizza, and a sketchy strand of hair. Since the pizza had a few bites taken out of it, investigators swabbed a slice for DNA and ran it through their national database. And they found a match. It was a 34-year-old man named Darren Dellen Dennis Wint. Dang, say that 10 times fast. Darren Dellen Dennis Wint. Darren Dellen Dennis Wint. Darren Dellen Dennis. So since Darren worked for Savas, he definitely knew this man had money. And if he was fired, well, there's the motive. And based on his criminal history, he was clearly capable of holding his rich ex-boss captive and scamming fat stacks of money from him before whacking him out alongside his wife, son, and housekeeper. Investigators started looking for Darren, but they had no luck. Then they got in touch with his dad, who said he would call his son for them. When Darren answered the phone, the detectives got on the line and told him to turn himself in by either calling 911 or finding an officer. But instead, he made a run for it. Well, duh, what kind of officer thinks calling a mass executioner and telling them to turn themselves in is a smart idea? Like, they really couldn't have been more secretive about tracking him down? Not smart. Well, a week after the initial incident, officers were able to track down Darren on the road. They pulled him over and searched his car, where they found thousands of dollars in cash. Since he had the cash with him and DNA evidence tied to the scene, that was it for Darren. He was arrested and given a trial date. Here's how investigators theorized the whole thing went down. Savas was at his martial arts studio and Amy was at their mansion with their son and the housekeeper. Darren broke into the mansion and forced Amy to call Savas and ask him to come home, so she did. After Savas came home, Darren made his ex-boss reach out to his assistant to coordinate the money drop. Officials concluded that Darren beat all 4 individuals and held them hostage for around 18 hours. But before icing them out, he ordered a pepperoni pizza from Domino's. And he used Savas' credit card. Damn, this guy is savage. It's already bad enough that he ordered a pizza in the middle of such an awful event, but to use the victim's credit card? That's just plain rude. And did the pizza delivery dude not notice any of this was going on when he dropped the za off at the crime scene? It is blowing my mind how many people went up to this house when 4 people were inside being held against their will. First the assistant, then Vera's husband, and now the Domino's driver? That next morning, Vera's husband showed up and left. The assistant popped by and left the cash in Amy's Porsche. Darren wiped out everyone in the house, doused everything in gasoline, set the house on fire, and fled the scene in the Porsche. After that, he abandoned the car and set that on fire too. That is so messed up. And why did Darren want Savas gone so bad? I understand he may have been frustrated about getting fired, but that was 5 years ago. And even if he was mad at Savas, why bring his poor wife, son, and housekeeper into the mess? Darren didn't go to trial until 3 years after the big event. Prosecutors initially believed Darren didn't act alone, but he's been the only suspect connected to the crime. Darren tried to pin the executions on his 2 younger brothers. He said they tricked him into going to the house and leaving his DNA on the pizza crust. Damn! He just did his brothers so dirty with that. And it still makes so much more sense that the guy who was fired by Savas would be more likely to attack him than the brothers. Also, what happened to bro code? Darren's attorney told the jury that Darren was a nice person and didn't seem violent when he represented him in earlier cases. Dude, isn't that your job to have your clients back? Of course you're gonna say he's nice, but also, didn't he have previous assault charges? Oh, and get this. The attorney also said it couldn't have been Darren because he didn't like pizza and apparently never ate it. Okay, That is 100% a lie. Who doesn't love pizza? And why would his DNA be on the za if he didn't eat it? Well, the jury found Darren guilty for all slayings, and he was given 4 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Darren recently tried to request a new trial because he's still saying his brothers did it. He's still holding on to that. The proof is in the pizza, bro. We know you did it. And both brothers had an alibi. But Darren's lawyers claimed one of the brothers' alibis wasn't so solid. He claimed he was at a friend's house watching a YouTube music video, but one of the girls who lived at the house he was reportedly at said he would call or text before stopping by, but his phone records show no texts or calls between the two, until days after the slayings. Yo, that is such a stretch. Darren's lawyers are really out here hustling for anything to get him out of jail. I think the brother clearly had to be telling the truth, because how do you make up such a specific alibi like that? As of now, no further advancements had been made in Darren's claim, and he's still in jail. One thing I don't understand is why didn't Darren get Savas to request more money than $40,000? Like, if he's gonna go through all of the trouble of holding 4 people hostage and slaying them, you'd think he'd do it for a bigger return, right? And if Savas owned a $4.5 million mansion, Darren probably could have squeezed out a few more zeros if he really tried. Wait, you wanna know what I just thought about? The daughters. Yeah, Savas and Amy's 2 daughters were at boarding school when all of this happened. They definitely dodged a bullet, but I bet it was so brutal to find out about the whole thing. Well, that about sums it up. If I could give you one piece of advice from this story, if you want to cover up a crime, you better have a good plan. Or just have a butter cookie. Thanks for watching.
Hello, all of you beautiful people. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Killer Bites, the show where we talk about the craziest true crime stories out there. If there's a particular story you'd like us to cover, let us know in the comments. Today we're covering the case of Mark Weier, the man who almost got away with using a hammer to end his wife's life. But you guys, he had a really good reason. He wanted to run away with another woman and framed it on somebody else. The things people do for love cannot be me. Let's get into it, shall we? Mark Weier was born on November 26, 1962 in the sweet little Midwestern town of Springfield, Illinois. He grew up in a tight-knit Jewish family, and they really valued the time they spent together. This stayed with Mark into his adulthood, and he grew up always wanting a family of his own one day. So that's when Mark's brother set him up on a blind date with Donnah Brown. Everyone who knew Donnah loved her and said she was the most genuine, fun, and loyal person. And you know how some people were just born to be moms? She was one of those people. Donnah is what I like to refer to as the cool mom friend who you always go to for advice and a good ass time. Well, when Donnah and Mark met, they pretty much clicked like that. Donnah loved that Mark was funny and smart, and once they started officially dating, he was the most attentive person. He always made Donnah the priority, and everyone just loved the two of them together. And wouldn't you know it, on March 4th of 1988, Mark and Donnah got married. After they tied the knot in Florida, Mark got a job as a nuclear engineer in Springfield, Illinois. So they headed to the Midwest to start this new chapter of life together. Unfortunately, the couple was unable to conceive a child after trying for a while. She was at her doctor's office when her doctor brought up a young patient who was pregnant, but they couldn't take care of the baby. They were looking for a great couple who were ready to be parents. Well, Donnah was in the right place at the right time, and on May 27th, 1995, Bailey Elizabeth Weier was brought into the family. Donnah's best friend, Deanne Schultz, worked with her at the hospital and loved watching Bailey. A few months passed, and Donnah took a trip to visit her parents in Florida. She brought along Bailey, and they had a great time. But the trip back to Springfield was an uncomfortable experience for Donnah. From Florida, they flew into St. Louis and took a 90-minute airport shuttle ride back home. But the driver of the shuttle was genuinely freaking Donnah out. He talked to her about really inappropriate stuff and was swerving and speeding like a bat out of hell. Donnah and her 3-month-old were so scared that she worried they wouldn't even make it home. She told Mark what happened, and he was pissed, obviously. He told Donnah to write down everything that happened between her and this man so they could have a physical document. Afterwards, he rang up the manager of the shuttle transportation company and demanded to know who the hell this man was and why he hadn't been fired yet. The company manager said the driver's name was Roger Harrington, and he was promptly removed from their team. Less than a week after this weird drive home from the airport, Mark called 911 horrified and hyperventilating. Donnah had been brutally attacked in the living room. The choice of weapon? A hammer. Next to her lay a man with 2 bullets in his head. They were both hanging on to life at this point because their wounds were just so severe. Here's what happened. Mark was downstairs working out on the treadmill when he heard a really loud thud from upstairs. He ran upstairs to check it out, and that's when he heard Bailey crying from the master bedroom, but Donnah wasn't with her. She was just lying on the bed alone. Mark walked down the hallway and saw a man using a hammer to attack Donnah over and over again. It was just so brutal. Mark grabbed his firearm and fired it twice in self-defense. Sadly, both Roger and Donnah passed away. She was 31 years old. When Detective Cox checked the man's wallet on the ground, his ID said Roger Harrington, 27 years old. And in that moment, Detective Cox started to piece everything together. So as a bit of a side gig, Detective Cox owned a trailer park in which Roger Harrington was a tenant. He knew that Roger had a history of domestic disputes, so something like this wasn't entirely out of the ballpark. But get this, friends and officers were outside checking Roger's vehicle when they discovered a note in the front seat. It said, Mark Winger, 23 Westview Drive, 4:30 p.m. Detectives asked if Mark had any idea who the guy he fired at was. He asked, "Is his name Roger?" And the police were like, "OMG, yeah, what the hell?" To which Mark replied, "That's the man who's been stalking us all week." Mark goes on to tell them the story of Donnah's horrible shuttle from the airport experience and how Roger kept calling their home over and over again with the stalking and the harassment. Obviously, Roger was suspended from his job because of this. When you mess with people's money, it's almost inevitable that things will get ugly. Mark gets Roger fired. Roger now had a motive to attack. Detectives found pages of the notebook where Donnah documented this story and her own handwriting up on the fridge. Roger ticked a lot of boxes, and the court ruled that Mark acted in self-defense. So now this seemed like a done deal case, and it was time to mourn this terrible, inconceivable loss. Donnah's family flew out to Springfield to be with Mark after Donnah's passing. They all wanted to be together, and they wanted to support Mark through this traumatic experience. And for the next few months, members of the family would fly out and help him take care of his newborn baby. The family made sure to be in each other's lives because it felt like so much bad stuff was packed on top of the other that if they didn't support each other through it, they would fall apart. But after a while, the family couldn't keep up the constant traveling back and forth, so they decided Mark should hire some help. Being a single parent is difficult, especially after an event like that, so Mark took their suggestions and hired Rebecca Schultz. Rebecca was a super pretty young woman who instantly clicked with the family. After losing 2 moms at such a young age, Rebecca felt like she could really help this family and form a special bond. And a special bond would indeed be created. After a few months, life started to slowly move forward a little bit. Rebecca was there, and now the healing was really up and going. Shortly after, Rebecca and Mark were pregnant and having a child together. Can you believe that? Just a few months after your wife passed away and you took the life of a man in your living room? Seems a little quick to me, Mark, sweetie. And I gotta say, I don't know how I would react in a situation like that. If I was Donnah's family, I'd be really taken aback, but I guess you want him to be happy and move on, right? And they were, for the most part. But Deanne, y'all remember Deanne? She didn't like Rebecca and the whole situation with Mark. Mark was also getting around $150,000 in life insurance and thousands of dollars from the Crime Victims Compensation Fund. It's a fund that gives financial help to victims' families for funeral expenses, loss of income, and things like that. Shortly after the pregnancy, Mark proposed to Rebecca after converting to another faith to be with her. This shocked his rabbi and the whole family, honestly. Religion was super important to Mark and their entire family, so to just up and convert once you get your nanny pregnant was a significant shift for Mark's family. But in October 1996, Mark and Rebecca eloped in Maui. It was a super tiny, closed service, and they had a celebration dinner once they returned. But the family felt like this was all moving so freaking fast. And over time, Mark pushed out Donnah's family completely, even going so far as to say Bailey couldn't call Donnah's mother grandma anymore. She begged Mark to let her be a part of her grandchild's life, but he flat out refused. He doesn't want to think about Donnah anymore, which, listen, I can understand somebody wanting to move on with their life, sure. But to totally cut off your late wife's family is just out of this world weird to me. So the couple would parent 4 children together, 2 of which were adopted, including Bailey. At that point, Donnah's family backed off and let Mark live his new life. All the while, Roger Harrington's family was still fighting for justice. They just couldn't fathom that Roger committed this crime. Sure, he had a history of mental illness and outbursts. Still, he never seemed capable of committing an act so horrific. Luckily for them, some of the detectives working on the case didn't fully believe that Roger Harrington was to blame either. For starters, there were no signs of forced entry, meaning someone must have let him in. Why the hell would Donnah let Roger in, a man she's genuinely scared of leaving her baby on the bed? Furthermore, why the heck was there a note with Mark's name, address, and time written on it? Seems like Roger went to Mark's house as an invited guest. He said he never invited Roger over, and that looked like the end of that. Everything seemed to be coming to a complete close, and until Mark and his happy little butt couldn't stop making trips to the police station. Specifically, he showed up at the station asking for his weapon back. He would come to the station every so often to update the cops on his personal life. And then, get this y'all, Deanne, you remember Deanne, right? Well, Deanne came to the police in 1998 because she had been hiding a juicy freaking secret and it was eating her alive. She admitted that she and Mark were having an affair that began a month before Donnah's murder and continued a little bit after she had passed. Deanne claimed that Mark had wanted out of his marriage for a while. He had even mentioned that things would be so much easier if Donnah just wasn't living anymore. And then, this dude had the absolute audacity to ask her if she wanted to get in on the murder plot. Obviously, this is Donnah's best friend. Yeah, she's sleeping with her husband, but she didn't actually want to physically hurt her. Well, once she came out with this information, the investigators started connecting the dots. This wasn't Roger's doing. This was planned and executed by Mark Weier himself. It made sense to investigators. Mark had been unhappy in his marriage and wanted a way out of it for a hot minute. Once the crazy story with Roger came up, Mark took it as the perfect opportunity to take out Donnah once and for all. So even after giving Deanne a ring, he went on and married Rebecca anyway and had kids with her. So now the police have this in the bag. They could prove the affair, they had the note from Roger's vehicle, and they found some new pieces of evidence. Polaroids from the crime scene before the bodies were moved by paramedics were found, and these pictures weren't found or used for the first trial. The positioning of the bodies didn't match up with Mark's story in the slightest. On top of all this, Roger didn't even bring a weapon to the house. This guy had a freaking blade and a tire iron in his car and he didn't use either? Suspicious. Well, the jury found all of this very interesting, and after 13 hours of deliberation, Mark Weier was found guilty. On August 9th of 2002, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After all these years of Mark living everyday life, he was finally put away. Can you imagine being in this family? First, you feel so bad for your son-in-law because what a terrible thing to go through, right? And then you find out that he's the one who did it and framed an innocent man after he killed him. As for Rebecca, she filed for divorce, duh, and now takes care of Bailey along with her other children. And that, my friends, is the wild story of Mark Weier and how he almost got away with murder. Can you believe it? It just goes to show what is done in the dark almost always comes to light. Thanks for watching, everyone. My name is Allie, and I'll see you next crime.
Jennifer and June Gibbons were born on April 11th, 1963, and although their parents were originally from Barbados, the family relocated to raise the girls in Wales. Growing up, the girls were quite shy, and their parents had a lot of trouble getting them to come out of their shells and talk to other people. They just really didn't want to interact with anyone else and preferred hanging out with each other. But like, who wouldn't when you've got a built-in buddy everywhere you go? No need to make friends when you're a package set. When the girls were toddlers, their mom noticed that they had a lot of difficulty talking, and she worried that they might grow up with speech impediments. The twins would talk to each other, but not in the way normal kids talked. The girls spoke really quickly and in a version of Creole that made it totally impossible for anyone to understand them. And the kicker? The twins also moved in perfect synchronism. Okay, I gotta say, I was with them up until this part. Identical twin? Sure. Wouldn't talk to anyone? Yeah, I get it. But moving at the same time? That's a hard pass for me, dog. So how exactly would they do this? Apparently, when one twin would start a movement, the other would just follow perfectly and complete the movement with them. So like, if Jennifer started walking in front of June, June would walk in perfect synchronicity with Jennifer, oftentimes without even having to watch her. And get this, anytime the twins did this in public and got double takes or strange looks, they would just immediately stop and freeze in place and just stare at the person until they'd leave. The Gibbons family were some of the only people of color in their entire neighborhood, and the twins were the only black children at their entire school, so the racism and bullying towards them was rampant. It doesn't take a historian to know that being the only black children in the neighborhood in the 60s was not going to be an easy experience. The girls were totally traumatized by their peers, and this only caused them to cling to each other more. And soon their language became more idiosyncratic and completely impossible to understand. The bullying actually got so bad that the girls had to be sent home early from school each day just so they could avoid the other children on campus who'd be waiting to torment them. Because the twins wouldn't speak to anyone besides each other, they earned the nickname the Silent Twins. Their parents sent them to speech therapists and regular therapists to try to understand why the girls just wouldn't talk. But the girls refused to talk to anyone, and they wouldn't even talk to each other when the therapists were in the room. The only breakthrough a therapist has with them is when she's able to get the girls to read on tape for her, but only after she's left the room. Okay, I was shy, but I wasn't that shy. These girls are starting to worry me a bit. So a speech therapist finally figured out the strange language that the girls spoke to each other was a combination of Barbados slang with broken English spoken really, really fast so that no one could understand what they were saying. And on top of that, the girls had West Indian accents and pronounced their S's as SH's because of their speech impediment, which is why it was literally impossible to understand what they were saying. Their language truly had a little bit of everything, and they were the only native speakers of it in existence. Apparently, the Gibbons gabbling is an example of cryptophagia, a real phenomenon when twins invent their own language, which I literally didn't even know there was a word for that. The more you know. Experts also said that cryptophagia was present because the twins mirrored their movements exactly. The Gibbons therapist said she could tell that June really wanted to speak to her, but it was like Jennifer wouldn't let her. Ooh, this is gonna be good. She detected the subtlest eye movements from Jennifer every time June looked like she was about to say something. June called this eye language. You've heard of body language? Get ready for body language's terrifying cousin, eye language. Shivers. The therapist said it was as if June was possessed by her twin. The Gibbons family would try to get the girls to engage with them in dinner conversation or with their 3 other siblings. But besides their younger sister, Rosie, June and Jennifer refused to speak to anyone else besides each other, and their parents were at a loss. No kidding. On the recommendation of multiple therapists, the girls were sent to different boarding schools in the hopes that they would branch out and learn to be independent. But when the parents tell the girls they were going to be separated, the girls lost their fucking minds. They started screaming and crying and even began hitting each other and digging their nails into each other's skin. And June ends up pulling a huge chunk out of Jennifer's hair, and they sprint out of the therapist's office. And the therapist is like, I think that went well. When the girls got to their respective boarding schools, they both completely isolated themselves to the point where they would just lay in their beds like they were in a coma. They wouldn't talk or eat or even move, and when people tried to move them, they would go completely limp and make it more difficult to help them. When their parents and therapists realized that things were not going to plan, they pulled the girls out of school and took them back home. When the girls were back home, things got better for the twins. Well, not necessarily better, but just back to the normal not talking to anyone but each other shtick. But hey, at least they weren't catatonic anymore. So baby steps, right? When the girls were reunited after boarding school, they spent the first 2 years together completely isolated in their bedroom with their door shut. And the shit that happens in that room is so beyond bizarre. So the girls would make these big elaborate plays for their dolls that were always in this like weird soap opera style. And the only way we know this is because they would sometimes record themselves doing it on tape and give it to their sister Rosie as a gift. One of their favorite things to do was be each other. So Jennifer would say, I'm June now, so you're Jennifer. And they would play out scenes and scenarios as each other. And when one of them wanted to stop, they would say, okay, I want myself back now. I'll give you yourself back. And by no means am I a child psychologist, but I've got to imagine that that stuff really messes with your head. The girls' identities were already so tangled up in each other that I'm really scared as to how this sort of charade fueled their fires. I mentioned that the girls like to play pretend with their dolls, which isn't unusual for young girls. But what was unusual was the type of backstories they'd give the dolls. The girls would write down their doll characters' information in their notebooks, and when they did, they would make sure to include when and how each doll passed away, and they would create these like family origins for these dolls, which like, can you imagine the parents walking past their children's bedroom door and hearing, what about this girl? I think she was found at the bottom of a pool. What do you think? At this point, the girls wouldn't even eat their meals at the table with their family. All their food would be sent up to their room and left on these trays outside their door. Like, the parents had completely given up at this point. As long as the girls were willing to eat, they were willing to do whatever it took. I honestly feel so bad for these parents, and it seems like the girls had almost learned how to be master manipulators. Their mom bought them personal journals for Christmas, and she was hoping this would kind of help them find themselves, or at least let mom know what the hell was going on inside their heads since they wouldn't talk to her. Each twin just wrote about the other twin most of the time, so her plan didn't exactly work, but at least she now knew what they were thinking. But the stuff that they wrote in their journals is super interesting. Jennifer wrote in her journal that the two of them had become fatal enemies, and that they each had deadly rays coming out of them that stung each other's skin. Jennifer also wonders if it's possible to get rid of her own shadow, and if she would live or not if she ever did. And I don't think she's talking about her shadow in the Peter Pan sense. June wrote about Jennifer, saying that no one suffers the way she does, calling her a dark shadow that robs her of sunlight. Jesus. She says she is afraid of her sister and that her sister might do something to her one day. And then she says, and I quote, "She is not normal. Someone is driving her insane, and that someone is me." So you're telling me that the girls actually hated each other? But then why would they? Yeah, I'm just gonna accept that there's gonna be a lot of things about this case that I will never understand. So clearly there was a turning point in this relationship, as the sisters really started to piss each other off. And at one point, Jennifer even tried to off June by submerging her in water. June and Jennifer started getting into these heated arguments that would often result in them strangling, hitting, and attempting to drown each other. But the girls would always make up in the end and be friends again, up until it was time for the next big spat. Jeez. Talk about a toxic relationship. When the girls were teenagers, they started experimenting with drinking and the devil's lettuce. And then they started getting into petty crimes. It seemed like they were addicted to taking risks now. And when they saw that a former classmate's house had been left unlocked, they decided, YOLO, and went inside. The twins snooped around without any sort of motive besides just getting back at a classmate who used to torment them. They rifled through clothes, touched valuable items, and even broke a door. But when the parents came home unexpectedly, the pair was caught red-handed. The owners of the home had known of the girls and felt bad for them, so they just ended up letting them go home. They tried to ask the girls why they were there and what they were doing, but the silent twins were unsurprisingly silent. I know, big shock there, right? After the break-in at their classmates' home, the Gibbons girls were suddenly obsessed with their classmates' brothers, and they started hanging out with them and partaking in even more risky youth activities. The girls would put on a full beat of makeup to hang out with these guys. They'd bring a bottle of whatever and would walk to some place to go hang out with them. As their rebellion phase continued, June and Jennifer would graffiti walls, play Ding Dong Ditch, and then when that wasn't enough, they decided to dip their toes into the world of arson. Yes, really. So they burned down a tractor store together, and then they set fire to Pembroke Technical College, which is how they're eventually caught. And I thought my rebellion phase of bottom eyeliner and listening to Paramore was hardcore. At age 19, the girls were arrested and a judge ordered them to a high-security psychiatric hospital in England. June and Jennifer lived in this institution for 11 long, terrible years. Within days of arriving there, June attempted to take her own life, and Jennifer attacked a nurse. So it's not exactly going great. The girls were studied by experts the entire time they're there, and the experts have never seen anything like them before, so they were absolutely fascinated. When they tried to separate the girls once again went bananas and started screaming, yanking their hair out, and clinging to the walls. But the doctors insist it's for their own good. The twins were catatonic for most of the time, staring fixed at the walls or lying silently on their beds. But then the nurses and orderlies started to notice something happening that they just couldn't explain. Time to sprinkle in the spook, y'all. They have stories where they said they would walk into one twin cell and she'd be standing there frozen in this really specific awkward position and would just hold it there for hours. And when they would go down the hall to the other twin cell, the other twin would be standing there, frozen like a statue, holding the exact same pose as her sister. If you saw that in a horror movie, you'd be like, psh, that can't be real. But it actually happened. They also noticed that the twins developed specific eating habits, where one would eat a ton of food at one time, and the other would barely eat. And a week later, it would be vice versa. I don't think these girls were born psychopaths, but I can't completely rule out that they probably struggled with some form of mental illness. But the powerful twin connection that the girls were about to display when they get out is something that I don't think I'll ever be able to comprehend. At some point during their hospitalization, the twins agreed that one of the twins would need to kick the bucket in order for the other to have any chance at living a free life. Wait. What? After 11 years in the maximum security hospital, when the girls were almost 30, they were set to be released to a more minimum security institution back home in Wales. On the morning of March 9th, 1993, the girls were taken by bus to the facility. On the bus, Jennifer laid down on June's lap and she said, "At long last, we're out." And then she slept with her eyes open. Upon arriving at the facility, Jennifer wouldn't wake up. No freaking way. She was taken to the hospital, and despite the doctor's efforts, Jennifer passed away of what they could only guess was some sort of inflammation in her heart. Doctors found no traces of meds or poison in her system, and no previous heart conditions. She had just suddenly passed away. June said that she felt free at last, and that Jennifer gave up her life so that she could be liberated. June believed for the rest of her life that Jennifer willed her heart to stop. June went through her grieving period like any twin would, but after that, she lived a semi-normal life and tried to live it to the fullest for the both of them. She was still shy and reserved, but she'd talk to people and would just kind of go about her business. June said that after discussing it, they both had agreed that Jennifer had to be the one to sacrifice her life that day, and so she did. Can you believe? The silent twins lived very troubled lives, and it's so hard to understand what they meant by feeling trapped by their own shadow. Was this just an exaggeration from a dramatic preteen who was fighting with her sister? Or was there a deeper psychological factor at play, which caused the girls to go so far as to making a suicide pact? This is easily the strangest pair of twins I've ever heard of. Speaking of pairs, time to dig into this pear crisp. Thank you for joining us here at our true crime show, Killer Bites. Today we will be talking about the badass that is Susan Kuhnhausen. How many of you hate your ex so much that you wish they would just disappear? Now, how many of you would go as far as to kill them? I better not see any hands. Well, in today's case, we're talking about Susan Kuhnhausen, the woman who fought off the hitman her husband hired to slay her. Sounds pretty juicy, huh? Let's get into it, cool cats. Susan grew up in a home with divorced parents, and it wasn't uncommon for her to move around frequently. She went from Colorado to Arizona to California to Nevada. She was moving all over the freaking place. She never knew what it was like to see a healthy relationship work out. She had a bunch of different step-parents and lived in a lot of different homes. In the 80s, Susan made the move to Oregon and fell in love with Portland. She was a regular at a local comedy club and was known to sit super close to the stage to watch the comics. I love that she was so into comedy, but something about sitting front row at a comedy show scares me. You are a direct target for any roast coming from a professional comedian. If you sit in the front row, I salute you and your bravery. But since Susan hadn't seen super healthy relationships growing up, she was single and a little timid about jumping into a relationship. So in 1988, her mom put out an ad in the newspaper on Susan's behalf. It mentioned that she was a single 33-year-old woman who was overweight but not over life. She wanted someone who cared about more than just looks or how skinny you were. She wanted someone she could have good conversations with and someone to make her laugh. Isn't that what we all want? Also, something about taking out a dating ad in the paper is kind of iconic. It's giving me Newsies vibes, and I support it. A little bit of time passed, and a man named Mike replied to the newspaper ad. It freaking worked, y'all. Mike told Susan that he was a combat veteran who served in the Vietnam War. After no more than a year of dating, the two got married. They weren't wasting any time. But shortly after they tied the knot, Mike's true colors started to show. He wasn't anything like Susan had initially thought. Susan found military records of Mike's time in Vietnam, but he wasn't in combat. Instead, he was listed as a switchboard operator. So he wasn't wholly lying, but he wasn't exactly out there on the front lines. Mike got a job at an adult video store as a janitor, and it was clear that he was unhappy in his life. Sadly, he took his sadness and tried to rip any joy from Susan. He would talk about how much life sucked all the time and how nothing would ever get better. He was incredibly controlling and abusive to her. If he wasn't getting on her case about spending money, no matter how little, he would scream at her anytime she wanted to hang out with her friends. She just wants some form of happiness, dude. Let her live. Susan was trapped in this marriage where no matter what she did, she would be scrutinized and yelled at. She had to walk on eggshells just to live her life. It sounds terrifying. And you would think maybe Mike lives a super strict lifestyle and wants to save money? Yeah, that would make sense if he wasn't addicted to Diet Coke and chain smoking. He wasted money all the time. It wasn't about the money. It was about controlling his wife and criticizing her actions until she broke. Well, after 17 years of marriage, Susan had finally had enough. And I don't freaking blame her one bit. If you are in an abusive relationship, physically, emotionally, whatever, I know how hard it can be to leave your situation. But just know it's incredibly brave for you to take those steps. In September of 2005, Susan told Mike to get his sorry butt out of her house. On the 6th, Susan visited the salon to get her hair done after finishing up her shift. She worked as a nurse in the emergency room at the same hospital for 30 years. After her hair appointment, she drove home to her house in southeast Portland. When she walked up to the home, she noticed that the curtains to her house were closed. She always made sure to open them before leaving for work. She didn't think about it for too long though, and went inside. She found a note from Mike saying that he had gone out. He had been having trouble sleeping and was gonna relax on the beach for a couple of days. Susan hadn't changed the locks or the code to the alarm after they had split up, so that's how he was able to leave the note. As she went towards her bedroom, she noticed that it was unusually dark. She always left the curtains open during the day to let the sun in, but this time, something didn't feel right. All of a sudden, a man jumped out from behind the curtains and ran at Susan. He was wearing yellow rubber gloves, a baseball hat, khaki pants, and a striped shirt. He held a claw hammer in his hand. Really, dude? Khaki pants? You wore Dockers to slay someone? That's a crime within itself. Here's the thing. Susan might look unsuspecting, but having been a nurse for over 30 years, she knew a thing or two about self-defense. And at that moment, Susan said she was confident that whoever that man was, he was there to end her life. I can't even imagine the adrenaline that must have kicked into her body. The intruder got a hit to Susan's head, but she bit down hard through his skin. She wanted people to know that she had fought like hell for her life. She wasn't going down without a fight. And this woman worked in the ER, so she had seen some stuff, okay? She dealt with people going through withdrawals and cracked open people's chests for heart surgery. She wasn't a stranger to some intense medical sites. But Susan was a tiny woman, coming in at around 5'4", a whole 5 inches shorter than the crazy person attacking her. But this didn't stop her, and in fact, she outweighed him, giving her an interesting advantage. The struggle went on for about 15 minutes, and the attacker even said, "You're strong," to Susan at one point. Okay, no, you don't come into my house, attack me with a claw hammer, and then try to compliment me on my athletic ability? Pick a side, dude. Susan screamed back at the guy, asking who sent him, but with no answer, she got him into a chokehold. She squeezed the crap out of his neck, but offered to call him an ambulance if he piped up and said who hired him. The guy still wouldn't speak, so Susan kept tightening her grip until he turned purple and blue. This freaked her out though, because, hello, she wasn't expecting to slay a guy when she got home from the salon. So Susan let go and booked it out of there. But the attacker caught up to her, trapped her in a narrow hallway, and punched her so hard it split her lip open and she fell to the ground. Susan dragged him right down with her though, and started biting the crap out of him. She was trying to leave any possible DNA evidence that could link her body with this attacker. She managed to get on top of the guy and started choking him out again. He still wouldn't tell who sent him in the first place, and she kept squeezing until this time, he stopped breathing. Terrified, Susan ran to her neighbor's house and called the police immediately. She had no idea if the man was dead or not, but she wasn't sticking around to find out, you know? Dispatchers asked the neighbor if Susan had any beef with her ex-husband, and right away the pieces started to fall into place. When police arrived, they identified the attacker's body as Edward Haffey, a 59-year-old veteran. He worked with Mike at the adult video store. Edward did have a criminal past, which we'll get into later, but that didn't stop him from going along with the plan. The autopsy report showed an almost lethal dose of cocaine in his system the night he tried to kill Susan. In his backpack were his diabetes pills, a bottle of chocolate syrup, and his daily planner. September 6th, don't forget the claw hammer. But actually though, on the date of the attack, Mike Kuhnhausen's phone number was found scribbled into Edward's planner with a note next to it that read, "Call Mike, get letter." Very detailed notes you got there, Edward. As the police dug deeper into Edward's criminal history, they found that he had done time in prison for conspiracy to slay his own ex-girlfriend. A crime which he pled guilty for, mind you. Well, when the media got a hold of this, they really ran with it. A local man hires a hitman to execute his wife, but the wife executes the hitman? Now that is a news story. At this point, Mike was feeling like he was out of good options. Can't a guy plot his wife's demise in peace anymore? So he decided his next best move was to take his own life. He wrote a farewell note and bought a Taurus 357 Magnum. If you know anything about firearms, feel free to leave a comment below letting me know if that is a good choice for a weapon or not. To be honest, you could put any combination of letters and numbers together, and I'd think it was a high-tech piece of machinery. So Mike dropped off his note at his father's house and ran away. Luckily, he was found before he could make any rash decisions. On September 13th, the cops found Mike in the parking garage of a Geyser Permanente. He claimed that he had nothing left to live for and was trying to check himself in. Mike was put on a brief psychiatric hold, but not even a full 12 hours later, he was arrested because of his conspiracy to commit murder. Things always seem to creep up and bite you in the butt in these stories, huh? Susan ended up finally filing for divorce, and she now had a pretty good idea if she wasn't sure about how the marriage was working out before. She said that if she wanted Mike lifeless, she would at least have the balls to do it herself. And I really respect her badass energy. I mean, she's not wrong. If you want something done, you better do it yourself. But Mike was a chicken, and he wasn't gonna get his hands dirty if he didn't have to. Just weeks before the attack, Mike had lost his job. Susan had kicked him out of the house because she had chosen to get away from this sad sack, and here he was trying to get in on that life insurance policy. But he was no longer listed as a beneficiary to her life insurance policy. Rats. Well, what the heck are we supposed to do now? Even though Mike couldn't get in on that sweet, sweet life insurance money, he wasn't giving up so easily. The next best thing? He wanted the house. In the event of Susan's demise, that lovely piece of real estate would go to Mike Kuhnhausen. Luckily for him, the house was paid off in full and was worth over $300,000. Seems like a pretty sweet backup deal to me. He wasn't getting off the hook so quickly though. The investigator's job is to dig up dirt on you. Even if you think your story is bulletproof, they are there to poke holes in your story. They brought up Mike's relationship with Edward. They knew each other from the adult video store, and he denied. Come on, man. Just because I worked with the guy who tried to kill my wife doesn't mean I'm involved. Well, Mikey, that's exactly what that means. On the day of the attack, the security alarm had been disarmed. The only people who knew the code to the house were Susan and Mike. While Susan was at work, Mike went over to the house and shut off the alarm system. This is where he let Edward into the home for him to hide until Susan returned. If you're like me, you probably want to know how much money this Edward Haffey guy was going to get for doing all of this. A measly $5,000 was all Mike could offer up. When Edward said no, he pushed the number for $50,000, which is a pretty big jump if you ask me. With that, Edward agreed, and the plan was set. However, a witness spotted the two men in the parking lot of an Applebee's talking. They stood out because their faces had been in the news just days before. So after all of this, the evidence, the relationship to the hitman, and the fact that witnesses saw the two men hanging out together, there wasn't much more Mike could claim. In 2007, Michael Kuhnhausen pled guilty for his involvement with the hitman for hire plot. Despite all this drama, he only received 7 years in prison. Imagine being Susan in this scenario. How do you even function from this point forward? She was terrified that once Mike was released from prison, he would come after her again. She lived in constant fear that her life was in danger. Thankfully, Mike passed away in prison before he even had the chance to hurt Susan again. He was battling cancer, and eventually, he lost his battle at 92 years old. Susan spent a lot of time at the range, and I totally get it considering what she went through. She wanted to make sure that she was protected from that point forward. Even until his last day, Mike Kuhnhausen never took any responsibility for his involvement. He was really out there trying to say he was the victim. The nerve of some people, man. You gotta wonder. So how did Susan deal with all of this for the rest of her life? Well, Susan is a fighter and a total badass lady. She went on to share her story with the hopes that it could help others in abusive relationships. Susan decided that she wanted to help other victims and advocate for them. It can be scary to leave a relationship like that. You never know how your significant other will react and if they would go to these kinds of extremes. She was a crucial part of developing Case Companion, a website that answers all of the legal questions victims might have before going forward with their cases and helps track documents, court dates, etc. But Susan didn't feel totally relieved after all of this chaos. She still had a lot of trauma to work through. She claimed that the worst part of all of this was that she had to slay someone to stay alive. Even after everything she went through, Susan found compassion for Edward Haffey, saying that he probably had family and friends who loved him and was sorry for their loss. Can you believe it? This woman truly has a heart of gold. I don't know how she managed to keep such a positive, active outlook through such dark times. And on a total side note, all of this started with a newspaper ad looking for love. She wanted to find someone who genuinely liked her, despite her appearance, which she looks fire, and good for her. Susan later changed her last name to Walters because she wasn't about to walk around with Michael's stupid name attached to her. At the end of the day, this is a story about fighting like hell and never giving up. While Susan didn't want to end a life, she wanted to save herself and did what needed to be done. She's a rock star and is using her story to help others. That's all I have for you all today. How do you feel about this case? I just don't think I'll ever understand people like Michael, and that's okay with me. If you're gonna go as far as to execute your ex-wife, maybe do it yourself to make sure the job is done right. See y'all, this is what happens when one person does more work for the group project. Things inevitably get messed up. You know the old saying, too many cooks in the kitchen. Well, we'll see you next time.
If you think you have a crazy story, think again, because what I'm about to tell you is definitely the craziest story I've ever heard.
It's about a guy who had a creepy obsession with little kids to the point where he ended up executing, butchering, and cooking them into meals.
But he didn't stop there. This dude would host cookouts coincidentally around the time his victims disappeared, where he would feed mysterious tasting meat to his friends and family. Shall we dig in?
Nathaniel Jonah grew up in the town of Worcester, Massachusetts. He was born in 1957 with the name David Paul Brown, but later changed his name.
Which automatically makes me think he's a criminal if he's changing names.
Well, Nathaniel was known for being quite an oddball as a kid. He apparently liked picking and sucking on his scabs, which his mom got multiple calls about from teachers at his school.
And when Nathaniel was 7, he told his neighbor, who was a 5-year-old little girl, that he just got a Ouija board and wanted to test it out with her in the basement.
Oh no, not the basement. What parent would give their 7-year-old kid a Ouija board?
Like, it's a board game that was literally invented to summon demonic spirits. No thanks.
Well, when his little girl neighbor got down to the basement, Nathaniel tried to strangle her. His mom heard the little girl screaming and ran downstairs to rescue her.
His mom assumed her son wasn't really aware of what he was doing and brushed it off.
And it turns out that Nathaniel must have known what he was doing because he kept doing stuff like that over and over again.
Over the course of his teenage years, Nathaniel lured a 6-year-old boy out to a hill to go sledding and physically violated him when he got there.
Pretended to be a cop to get an 8-year-old boy in his car, where he then assaulted and choked him,
and acted like he was a cop again, where he drove to Connecticut, kidnapped a little girl, attacked her, and threw her out of the car.
But Nathaniel only had to serve a few months of probation for these crimes.
There are so many things wrong with all of this.
And Nathaniel ended up getting released from parole early and was even sent a letter thanking him for his cooperation.
They are thanking him for kidnapping and assaulting little kids? In what world is that okay?
When he was 20, Nathaniel pretended to be an FBI agent, falsely arrested 2 boys in a movie theater, and took them to a remote location where he physically violated them.
Then, he left one of the boys in the trunk of his car, smothered the other boy with his 375 pounds worth of body weight, and drove off with the first boy still in his trunk.
Nathaniel thought the kid he left lying limp on the ground had bit the dust, but he was still alive and ended up running to get help and reported Nathaniel to the police.
The police were able to track down Nathaniel and rescue the other boy from the trunk. Officials then arrested and charged Nathaniel for attempting to slay the 2 boys, and he was sentenced to serve in jail for 18 to 22 years.
That is seriously so sick.
Also, why is Nathaniel so obsessed with pretending to be a cop to snatch up kids? Like, does he just have a cop costume handy in the trunk of his car for when he feels kidnappy?
After Nathaniel went to jail for his whole movie theater stunt, he was transferred to a mental facility. There, he changed his name from David Paul Brown to Nathaniel Benjamin Levi Bar Jonah.
Okay, that has to be one of the longest names I've ever heard.
Well, Nathaniel was apparently Jewish, and he told his friends and family that he changed his name because he wanted to know what it was like to be discriminated against as a Jew. So when Nathaniel was serving his time at this facility, he told a psychiatrist that he had fantasies about executing people, cutting them up, and eating them.
Eating people.
So in 1991, 14 years into his sentence that was supposed to be 18 to 22 years, Nathaniel was released.
The judge apparently didn't think a man who tried to smother multiple little kids and admitted to fantasizing about eating them was crazy enough to stay in prison. So he agreed to release the creep on probation and recommended for Nathaniel to seek psychiatric help.
Recommended? That should be required for this dude.
About a month after being released, Nathaniel was back on his same old creepy shit. He saw a little boy sitting alone in a car at a post office and decided to break into the car and smother the little boy with his body, which at the time Nathaniel weighed 275 pounds.
The mom literally saw it happen and had to run and save her kid. Then Nathaniel ran away but was eventually caught by the cops. And one of the officers said he recognized Nathaniel from when he was arrested 15 years earlier.
So Nathaniel told the police that he broke into the car to escape the rain, but later admitted to trying to knock the boy out.
For this arrest, Nathaniel was sentenced to 2 years on probation under the condition that he moved to Montana to live with his mom and never come back to Massachusetts.
Okay, so do they think Nathaniel is gonna stop if he moves to a different state? I think they're just sending this guy to another place for their police to deal with.
So when Nathaniel moved to Montana, he reportedly started collecting a bunch of toys, which at first seems pretty normal. Nathaniel was collecting these toys and apparently having yard sales to give them away, which seems so weird to me. Like, why buy something if you're gonna immediately turn around and sell it?
Well, most people think Nathaniel had these yard sales just to lure in crowds of kids.
In 1993, just about 2 years after Nathaniel moved to Montana, he was accused of assaulting an 8-year-old boy that he was babysitting. Nathaniel denied that claim, telling officials that if he really wanted to send the boy to his grave, he would have done it.
Okay, what parent in their right mind would leave their kid with this dude?
While we never really find out the truth about this instance, and Nathaniel was never convicted because his lawyer claimed his right to a speedy trial was violated and the case was dropped.
I don't understand how they can just drop a case like that. Don't they want this awful criminal off the streets?
Well, here's where things get terrible. In 1996, a 10-year-old boy named Zach Ramsey went missing. He reportedly left for school that morning but never made it there, so someone must have snatched him up.
And I'm just gonna go out there and say I think I know who did it.
Zach's parents filed a missing persons report and an investigation began.
Witnesses said they saw an off-white car almost run over Zach that morning. They also mentioned the boy was crying and looked like he was being followed by an overweight man in a navy blue police-like jacket.
The detective who was on Nathaniel's previous case thought it was him again. Yeah, no shit. So officials tried to find something that would pin him to the crime.
The detective was unable to get a search warrant, but he did find out that Nathaniel had access to his mom's off-white Toyota Corolla.
He also discovered that Nathaniel had the day off Zach went missing, was seen in an alleyway right before Zach walked by, was supposedly wearing a navy blue jacket that morning, and mentioned Zach's name to someone he knew a few days before the little boy disappeared.
Okay, so this is either a series of crazy coincidences or Nathaniel kidnapped Zach. And I'm leaning more towards the second one.
Well, even though the detective was able to gather all this information, he was still unable to get a search warrant and the case went cold for a few years.
Nathaniel moved out of his mom's house shortly after Zach's disappearance.
Flash forward to 1999, Nathaniel was seen standing outside of a school wearing a navy blue jacket and hat with a fake badge. He also had a toy Glock and 2 cans of pepper spray on him.
He was arrested and charged for impersonating an officer and carrying a concealed weapon.
Wait, they're able to arrest him for pretending to be a cop, but they can't arrest him for kidnapping a little boy? How does that work?
Anyway, with this arrest, detectives were able to get a search warrant so they could search through his apartment and his mom's house, which he used to live in.
Here's what they found. 2 dark blue jackets, one which had a fake police badge on the pocket, another fake badge, a stun weapon, a baseball hat that said security enforcement,
2 documents about tying people up and smothering them, and a pulley on Nathaniel's kitchen ceiling.
Then detectives got another search warrant to search for more documents and photos, and that's when things got really bad.
Officials found several lists with boys' names on them, including 3 of the boys he had previously abused.
But wait until you hear what one of the boys' names was.
Zachary Ramsey, aka the little boy who went missing.
And next to Zachary's name, Nathaniel wrote the word died.
Stop, this is so bad. And it makes me wonder what the significance of all the other names on the list are. Actually, never mind. I don't want to think about that.
So investigators continued their search and found at least 3,500 pictures of kids, a bunch of newspaper clippings about Zach's disappearance,
undeveloped film, which ended up being inappropriate pictures of Nathaniel and 3 unidentified little boys,
and a book written in code that turned out to be a cookbook with recipes like little boy stew and barbecued kid.
Ugh.
In Nathaniel's garage, investigators found a big section of wood that was stained and covered in marks from a weapon that looked like it was a meat cleaver.
The wood was apparently scrubbed with bleach a bunch of times too, so officials believe that Nathaniel used this area as a cutting board.
The investigators then did a luminol test in the garage and found out that the word Tita was once written on the floor, which they later theorized was connected to the execution of a 15-year-old boy named James Tita.
They also found out what appeared to be human hair inside Nathaniel's meat grinder, which was later tested and determined to have belonged to an unknown male.
And last but not least, investigators literally found little boy bone fragments that were never identified.
This is so much worse than I thought.
So based on everything they found, detectives theorized that Nathaniel had butchered little kids and used them in recipes.
A few days after Zach's disappearance, Nathaniel apparently hosted a cookout where he served deer burgers that his friends and family said tasted a little off.
Nathaniel told him that he hunted the deer himself, but he didn't even have a hunting license or a rifle.
And Nathaniel had a lot of these shindigs where he would just cook for people and they always said the meat tasted weird.
It's one thing to have your own nasty criminal fetish, but don't bring other people into it without them knowing about it.
At this point, it was pretty obvious that Nathaniel was responsible for Zach's disappearance. Aside from having no alibi, matching the description of the perp, and owning pictures and newspaper cutouts of the boy, Nathaniel also had a few other things that tied him to the case. One of his old roommates said he remembered seeing a pair of gloves covered in liquid at their apartment, as well as some clothes that looked just like what Zach was wearing when he went missing. Nathaniel had also brought up Zach's name to his friends and roommates multiple times before and after the incident. But get this, Zach's mother refused to believe Nathaniel did this to her son. She didn't even think her son was 86th. She had apparently gone to a psychic who told her that her son was living in Italy. And she was so set on this theory that she threatened to defend Nathaniel if he was brought to trial for mowing down her son. Why would this woman not want justice for her son who was clearly made into a burger? Well, the charges relating to Zach's disappearance got dropped, so detectives shifted their focus to 3 of his other victims who they knew they could pin down. 2 of the boys from the list of names lived in Nathaniel's building and were identified in some of the pictures found at his apartment. One of them said Nathaniel invited him over for a sleepover and then violated him. But the other said Nathaniel was his friend and even visited him in jail and gave him a letter that said, "You treated me really nice. You have never harmed me in any way. I really miss you, big guy. You were like the dad I never had." And then there was a 3rd boy who was supposedly hung from the pulley on Nathaniel's kitchen ceiling. Okay, can we please get this guy convicted already? I can't handle this anymore. Finally, Nathaniel got a sentence that was better than his previous skimpy parole one. He was sentenced to 130 years in prison without the possibility of parole. But 6 years later, Nathaniel had a heart attack from his super high cholesterol and passed away. Yeah, if you eat a bunch of humans, you're bound to have high cholesterol, dude. Okay, so after hearing this story, I feel like I need to take 10 showers and drink a bunch of green juices or something. And I am so shook about Zach's mom thinking her 10-year-old son somehow made it over to Italy without her knowing, when all the signs were obviously pointing to Nathaniel cooking him into one of his disturbing recipes. Like, did the little boy even have a passport or anything? Anyway, I'm gonna take this as a lesson to only eat food that I've made myself, like this eggplant parmesan. Except I kind of lost my appetite, so I think I might need to wait a bit to eat it.
Delayed flights are the worst, and if you think that you've had a long one, just wait until you hear about the people aboard Pan Am Flight 914. So this plane took off from New York in 1955 and was supposed to land 3 hours later in Miami, but it somehow disappeared off the face of the earth until it landed 37 years later. Oh my God, I have already so many questions and we haven't even gotten started. All right, so this plane took off from New York in the summer of 1955. There were 57 passengers and 4 crew members on board. They were headed to Miami, which was supposed to be a 3-hour flight. But when their scheduled arrival time came around, the plane was nowhere to be found. So right now, it just seems like there could have been a short delay from winds or something like that. But things are about to get crazy. Shortly after takeoff, the air traffic controllers at the New York airport lost signal of the plane. Like, it literally disappeared in midair, which is already a little weird. Like, how did they just lose signal and start freaking out immediately? Well, a few hours later, the control tower radars at the Miami airport didn't show the plane either, and there also weren't any distress signals sent out, so no one knew what was going on or where this plane was. At this point, the air traffic controllers at the Miami airport are starting to panic. They contact the tower in New York, who tell them the plane just disappeared from their radar. Okay, so how do they not think to give them a heads up? Like, all it takes is a little, hey, we somehow lost an entire plane with 61 people on it. Let me see if it shows up. Authorities believe the plane must have crashed somewhere, which makes sense. If a plane disappears off the radar and doesn't land where it's supposed to, that seems like the only explanation. Rescue teams were immediately sent out, but they never found any signs of a plane crash. No bodies or plane's remnants were discovered anywhere. So the next thought is, the plane had to have had landed in the ocean. The route it was supposed to take passed over the Atlantic, so that would make the most sense. But even if that were the case, you'd think the flight crew would send out a signal for help or use their emergency equipment, you know, like the life jackets and the rafts and stuff, you know? There had to be some evidence of the plane if it landed in the water and the rescue teams never found any. If I were a 57 passenger plane, where would I be? Well, the case was never really solved, but an official statement was made saying that the plane had crashed and everyone on board passed away. That must have been so hard for the families of the passengers. They got no closure at all, other than being told that their loved ones must have passed away in a plane crash. But they didn't know where and had no proof to back it up. So for 37 years, everyone thought that this plane had mysteriously crashed and sank in the ocean, wiping out everyone inside. But then something insane happened. One fall day in 1992, Juan, an air traffic controller in Caracas, Venezuela, was going about his normal workday. He had just showed up for the day, made a cup of coffee, and sat at the desk to monitor flights. Suddenly, a new dot just popped up on the radar, out of nowhere. Juan was confused because all of his flights were accounted for. He thought it may be a mistake and checked the radar readings several times, but all the readings were correct, and as it got closer, Juan and his coworkers were actually able to see the physical plane. It was a DC-4 McDonnell Douglas aircraft, which is a super old plane that uses propellers instead of modern turbines. Juan thought it was weird that he saw that type of plane because it's not really flown anymore. But it was commonly flown in the 50s. In fact, it was the same exact model as the Pan Am Flight 914 that went missing 37 years later. Oh, things are starting to get a little freaky. So Juan and his coworkers have no idea what was going on. A dot just appeared on the radar out of nowhere, and they realized it's a super old plane that's flying in their direction. Then a voice came on over the radio. It was the pilot of the mysterious plane who asked in English, "Where are we?" What? The pilot doesn't know where he's flying? That's a little concerning. Like, isn't the sole purpose of a pilot's job to navigate the plane? Okay, so the random pilot dude asked where they were, and Juan told him that they were near the Caracas airport and asked where their flight was headed. There was a quick pause before the pilot said, "We are Pan Am Flight 914, heading from New York to Miami, Florida, with a crew of 4 and 57 passengers on board." Holy, what's going on? Maybe they're joking. Like, the story of that missing flight was pretty well known, so this pilot could have just had a bad sense of humor and tried to make a joke about the whole thing. But then, why would they be flying the same exact plane? This is super sketchy. Well, Juan thought it was pretty sketchy too. After what could have been an insensitive joke about a 37-year-old alleged plane crash, he asked the pilot a few more questions. He asked if they were involved in some sort of crash or if they attempted to make contact with anybody else. But the pilot casually said, "We were scheduled to land in Miami at 9:55 in the morning on July 2nd, 1955. Dude, this is so wild. This is like the real-life version of Interstellar. And who's gonna break the news to the pilot that it's almost 4 decades past their scheduled landing? Air traffic control cleared the plane for landing, and once it touched down, Juan asked the pilot over the radio, "Did you know today's May 21st, 1992? Then the pilot said, "What are you talking about?" How is this pilot so confused? Like, I cannot get over the fact that he is just so unaware. So during this time, the ground crew from the Caracas airport was getting ready to help unload the plane. But before they could get there, the pilot apparently lost his cool and screamed, "Oh my God." Yeah, and I bet he said a few other words too. I mean, he just found out that he's responsible for not getting 61 people to the right location or even the right decade. I would definitely flip out. And the Caracas air control team also said they heard all of the passengers yelling and panicking over the radio. Juan started to get nervous and told the security guards to go to the plane and let the passengers and the crew members off. But as the guards got closer to the plane, the pilot screamed, "No, do not get near. We are leaving now." Then he started the plane's engine, drove it down the runway, and took off. This is insane. He literally just flew back away. You can't hide from your problems forever, my guy. Trust me. And if you've already set your passengers back almost 4 decades, you might as well just let them off now to live the rest of their lives. And in Venezuela, that sounds like a great place to live. Also, I'm starting to question this whole story even more. Did these people age at all? And how were they completely unaware that so much time has passed? Shortly after the plane took off, it disappeared into the clouds and was no longer detected on the radar. The Caracas airport sent out 3 jets to try and track it down, but they found nothing. This is mind-blowing. Like, how is no one able to figure out what's going on? You would think with all of their technology, the air traffic control would be able to find out more. Like, how are they able to go to sleep at night knowing there could be missing planes all around them? So the rest of the story has a bunch of different endings depending on who you talk to. Some say the plane never reappeared after the Venezuela landing. Others don't even think the whole Venezuela thing happened in the first place and that the Pan Am flight never showed up after leaving New York in 1955. And some people actually believe the plane landed hours later in Miami, where they let out the passengers who looked like they never aged one bit. There aren't many details about the second landing, but apparently the staff at the Miami airport checked their records and confirmed that this plane was the same exact one that took off in New York 37 years earlier. They were shook. And yeah, I'd be questioning my whole life up until that point. Like, is time travel really a thing? Did this plane really have enough fuel to stay in the air for 37 years? Or enough food to at least last them that long? And don't even get me started on the bathroom. Ugh, okay, enough backroom talk. Let's get back to this theory. So the airport staff had a lot of questions too. They held everyone for a few hours for interrogation. They were also probably stalling a bit while they were trying to figure out what to do with the passengers. Yeah, like, did they even have passports or anything to verify who these people were? How did they know these weren't strangers posing as the same passengers from 1955? Like, these people could have created a replica of the plane to sneak into the US for some reason. Well, despite the confusion, the passengers and crew members were released and sent home. Somehow, these long-lost passengers were reunited with their relatives. And get this, the passengers apparently hadn't aged at all. So first of all, that had to be just so weird. These people already coped with the fact that they lost their loved ones, and I'm sure some of them remarried too. But like, imagine being one of these passengers who just realized you missed the last 37 years, and now you're meeting your wife's new husband? Damn, that's tough. So while all three articles printed in the Weekly World News were of the same event, some of the details didn't match up between the pieces. This seems to be their whole MO. And on top of that, of this not so credible newspaper publishing the same article 3 different times with jumbled details, in the last 2 times they printed it, they used pictures of 2 different men for one. As if things weren't already embarrassing enough, the news outlet printed a picture in the article that they claimed was of the plane when it landed in Miami. But internet sleuths later found evidence that the picture was just a stock photo of a plane from 1935, which is 20 years before the plane took off. And it apparently wasn't even a Pan Am plane either. Talk about fake news. Damn. The only other piece of evidence linked to this case is an old pocket calendar that was supposedly dropped out of a plane when it stopped in Venezuela. The calendar was from 1955, aka the same exact year that the plane initially took off at. Okay, Captain Obvious, that obviously had to be planted, right? Like, how is that the only piece of evidence from a ginormous plane with 61 people in it? Well, somehow, some way, people still think this plane existed, disappeared for 37 years, and landed in Venezuela to pick back up and land in Miami a few hours later. Either way, this story remains a mystery, yet somehow so many people across the country still believe it all happened. But as for me, I believe in UFO, so I'm gonna dig in. Thanks for watching. Travis Alexander was finally getting over a messy breakup with his previous girlfriend. He was putting himself back out there and started dating this new girl that he really liked. He'd also been planning this super sick vacation in Cancun with his friends. But what Travis didn't know was that he was never going to make it to Mexico that weekend. And instead of snorkeling with the dolphins, he would be sleeping with the fishes. When Travis Alexander missed a work call that he should have been leading, his coworkers and friends thought something was off. Travis was also supposed to meet his friends in Cancun for a vacation a few days later, but when the day he was supposed to arrive rolled around and he hadn't shown up at the resort, his friends started to panic. They called his coworkers in Arizona and asked them if he could go back over to Travis's place to check on him, and they did. But once they asked Travis's roommates where he was, they were told that Travis had left for a trip to Cancun a few days ago, and the coworkers were like, not according to his friends, and the roommates were like, oh, say what now? I feel like it's really weird that his roommates didn't know what day Travis was actually supposed to leave. But he also traveled a bunch for work and would sometimes stay at his friends' places. So he was kind of hard to keep track of. Anyway, the coworkers asked to check out the house just in case. But when they went inside, they found out that Travis's door was locked, which sounds sketchy, but it was actually pretty normal. So whenever Travis would leave for a trip or something, his Roommates said he would lock the door to his master bedroom so no one would mess with his stuff. Sounds like something I would do. Since his door had been shut and locked for a few days, the roommates just assumed he left for vacation. But when the co-workers found the key to the master bedroom and finally got inside, let's just say I hope they got a hefty raise that year to afford all the therapy that they would need. There were streaks of dark red and brown stains on the floor, drag marks leading from the bedroom to the bathroom, and Travis's lifeless body crumpled up in the shower. When the cops got there and asked if they know anyone who could have done this, all the friends unanimously respond with one name: Jody Arias. Let's go back in time to when Travis met Jody at a convention in Las Vegas. At the time, he was 29 and she was 26. Travis was the clean-cut Mormon dude who worked as a motivational speaker, and Jody was this cute, blonde, free-spirited photographer. The two hit it off immediately, and Travis invited Jody to be his guest at a special dinner that night. Travis and Jody must have had a great dinner that night because they talked until 4 a.m. He was a boy, she was a girl. Can I make it any more obvious? He was a Mormon and she did photography. What more can I say? Hashtag not my Avril. So even though Travis lived in Arizona and Jody lived in California, the lovebirds were able to make the long distance work by meeting halfway at a mutual friend's house in Murrieta. Travis's friends started to see red flags in the relationship, but Travis was falling for her hard and totally missed all of them. I mean, doesn't everything look red when you've got those rose-tinted glasses on? The friends started to note some dangerous behavior from Jody and told Travis they were concerned for his safety. One of Travis's pals literally told him that he was afraid he'd find Travis chopped up in a freezer one day. Also, how do you even respond to that? Hey dude, thanks for the heads up. Really appreciate it. Early on in their relationship, it was clear that Jody was obsessed with Travis. About a month into the relationship, Jody actually converted to Mormonism for him, which, as you know, is not one of the easiest religions to just pick up and join. But even though Jody was now saved, Travis still really struggled with his faith when he was with her. The couple was regularly beating the batter, which is a big no-no in Mormonism if that's going on before marriage. Travis's friends also noted that Jody was pretty possessive of her mans. Like, she would get extremely upset if he talked to other women while they're out in public. She also always needed to be next to him. Apparently, if Travis even went to the bathroom, Jody would go all the way with him and stand outside the door until he was done. Did someone get a helicopter? Oh no, that's just Jody. She also did this cute thing where she would forward emails to herself that Travis had with other women just so she could read them. I think I'm just gonna read all of my lover's long, boring work emails chains as a little bedtime treat. Jody's behaviors continued to get more odd and intense, where even Travis was starting to feel a bit uncomfortable with her around friends. One night, Travis was hanging out in a jacuzzi with Jody and some of his friends, and apparently Jody couldn't keep her hands off of him. She was like straddling him and getting super handsy and inappropriate. It got so intense that Travis had to physically push her off of him and yell at her to stop. I mean, hot tubs can be pretty steamy, literally and figuratively, but don't forget, these people are Mormon, so that wasn't really allowed. Finally, Travis's friends sat him down and told him that Jody was bad news. They expressed concern that his relationship with Jody was going to get him in trouble. As the friends were telling him this, they stopped and were like, yo, she's probably like outside the door listening right now, like she always does. But Travis was like, what? No, that's ridiculous. So one of his friends then walked over and whipped open the door to reveal Jody standing there, leaning in with what his friends described as an evil face. You just don't date women like that. Well, after 5 months together, Travis finally realized that his friends were right and he decided to break up with Jody. And that's when all hell broke loose. Jody stalked Travis for months. She was constantly showing up at his home in Arizona unannounced and wouldn't stop calling and texting him. She also let herself in through his garage because she knew the code. But even after Travis changed it, Jody found a way to get inside. How? By crawling in through the doggy door. So that's who let the dogs out. Travis tried to move on from his cray-cray girlfriend and started dating around with other women, which Jody did not like that at all. Jody would literally hack Travis's social media, send harassing emails to his new girlfriends, and even slash his tires every once in a while. Okay, literally checking my email is already stressful enough. Can you imagine checking your inbox and it's like, subject, if I can't have him, no one will. And then right below is an email about your annual dental checkup. The horror. So Travis began dating this new woman named Lisa, and of course when Jody learned about her, the claws came out. Jody tried to scare Lisa by running around her house at night, knocking on her doors and windows. Yeah, She was trying to scare Lisa like the freaking boogeyman. So despite Travis's new relationship, he still had a thing for Jody. Jody was his kryptonite, and while he may have been dating new people, the two were still seeing each other in secret and texting every day. Eventually, the passionate affair came to an end when Travis got in a text fight with Jody and called her a sociopath who was at the lowest of lows. So now that you know the backstory of Travis and Jody, let's travel forward in time to June of 2008. Right before Travis's vacation that never was. And at the time, Travis had a girlfriend named Mimi, who I'm sure Jody hated. Okay, so that month, Travis planned to go on a vacation to Cancun with friends, but because of an important work call he had to lead, Travis said he'd meet the crew at a resort a couple days later. Travis's friends in Cancun had been texting him one June day, asking what activities he wanted to do while they were there, but they couldn't seem to get a response from him. He missed the work call he was supposed to lead, and never checked in for his flight. And well, you guys know the rest. On June 9, 2008, more than a year after meeting Jody, Travis's body was found covered in bruises and bullet wounds. Officials determined that Travis had passed on June 4th, which meant he was literally sitting there lifeless in his own house with all of his roommates there for 5 days. The cops saw the scene in the hallway and knew that there was a major struggle and that it was deeply personal. Whoever it was, they wanted him gone. Around the scene, they found multiple long brown hairs, a palm print on the wall, and a camera in the washing machine. Within hours of Travis's body being found, Jody called the police to ask about the case. Officials asked Jody if she had seen her ex recently. She told them that she spoke with Travis briefly on the phone on June 4th as she was driving to Utah to see her new boyfriend, Ryan. Jody also denied ever being in Arizona the day he was attacked. When the memorial was held for Travis in Arizona, Lil Miss Jody rolled up to the service. While she was in Arizona, she gave her fingerprints to the police before heading back to her home in California. Well, not long after that, the detectives found a match for the palm print on the wall. It was Jody's. But believe it or not, that wasn't even the most incriminating piece of evidence the cops had against Jody, because they were able to recover the photos on the memory card from the camera found in the washing machine. And on the card, they found photos of Jody and Travis together that were timestamped on June 4th, the last day that Travis was ever seen alive. So while your headphones definitely won't survive a trip through the washing machine, somehow a camera memory card will. But I highly recommend you don't try this at home. So the cops went to California and brought Jody in for questioning. They also talked to Ryan, Jody's new boyfriend, who said his boo thing hadn't arrived in Utah until June 5th, a day after she was originally supposed to show up. Ryan also told detectives that he couldn't get a hold of Jody that whole day, like her phone just kept going straight to voicemail. But Jody told officials that her phone had died and she got lost, so she spent the whole night driving around trying to figure out where she was. The cops then asked Jody if she knew about her grandparents' recent break-in, where the only thing that was stolen from the house was a firearm that just so happened to match the caliber to the casing found on Travis's bathroom floor. Jody was sitting there adamantly denying that she ever was involved in the crime. The cops are literally holding up the photos of Jody and Travis timestamped on June 4th, and Jody was like, sitting there, I don't know what to tell you, I wasn't there. The detective was even quoted saying, no matter how much evidence I would tell her about, she was not going to admit that she was even there. But after a night in jail, Jody's story began to change. Her new claim was that she did in fact go to Travis's house. She said that she showed up around 3 a.m. and slept with Travis. Once he woke up and got in the shower, Jody apparently started taking photos of him. Because, you know, photography is her passion. As Jody was taking these photos, 2 masked intruders suddenly burst through the door and began attacking her and Travis. Jody said it was a man and a woman that were both absolutely hell-bent on taking out Travis. She claimed the intruders threatened to slay her and her family if she told anyone about what had happened. So she left as fast as she could and never looked back. Of course, the cops didn't buy this story one bit. They knew that Travis didn't have any other enemies in his life besides his crazy-ass girlfriend. There was also no physical evidence of anyone else having been in that room besides Jody. So they brushed off her story and took her to trial. But Jody's trial didn't begin until January 2013, so she was big chillin' in jail for 4 years while waiting to take the stand. And when she finally did, long gone was the story of the intruders. Now, Jody dropped a news story where she claimed she pulled the trigger in self-defense from the man she loved so dearly, Travis Alexander. She said that Travis was attacking her because she had dropped her camera, so she finally had to defend herself. Oh my God, this girl. For days on end, Jody testified that Travis was this violent man with an insane temper who assaulted her on several occasions, also said that she found inappropriate pictures of children on his computer. Police, of course, found no evidence for any of this to be true. Travis had no history of a temper or physical assaults in any of his past relationships, and no incriminating photos were found anywhere in his home or computer. His friends, family, and co-workers also testified about what a solid guy Travis was. They said his faith meant a lot to him and believed Jodi was telling a bunch of lies to try and paint herself as a more believable victim. Where was this person who was slashing tires and stalking girlfriends just a few months ago? The nerve of this woman. Travis's brother Steven said that Jodi's mission was to basically take out Travis again by destroying his reputation. He said the self-defense story was a joke and claimed his brother didn't even own a weapon. 2 different juries couldn't decide whether or not Jodi deserved capital punishment. After all was said and done, she was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But before she was sentenced, Jodi stated, "To this day, I can't believe that I was capable of doing something that terrible. I'm truly disgusted and repulsive with myself. I'm horrified because of what I did, and I wish there was some way I could take it all back." Today, Jodi still sits in Perryville Prison in Travis's hometown of Mesa, Arizona. According to fellow inmates, Jodi is not very well liked because she's always flirting with the guards to try and get special treatment. Some things never change. In 2016, Jodi gave an interview talking about what her daily life was like in prison. She said, "It's all good. If this is what it's like to be hated, then keep hating. I've had so much love coming in my direction, I can't even respond to it now." While in prison, Travis's villainous ex-girlfriend has shifted her focus from her photography to illustration. In fact, you can purchase her artwork straight from the cell to your home on her website, artbyjodiarias.com. And most of the money goes straight towards her appeals. So, if you think she's guilty, I'd think twice about purchasing. Apparently though, this girl's got quite a few supporters. There's a website called JodiAriasInstant.com where you can find the hundreds of Arias' fans who advocate for her innocence. You know, I truly don't see how anyone could look at the evidence against Jodi and possibly think that she's innocent. But honestly, I guess that's just the way the cookie crumbles.